The Star Trek Adventures Role-Playing Games Player's Guide is the first in a new turning of the wheel after 4 years of releases and 4 years out in the trenches of the role-playing game world. This is a book that speaks directly to the human being that is going to be around the role-playing game table about the particularities of this role-playing universe. In this universe, and this particular rule set means that the experiences are going to be a little bit different. Opportunities and challenges don't exist in the rest of your role-playing life. The book is sort of giving you a heads up on this, it's providing some meditations, and it can open up some doors for players to go boldly. So without further ado, let me introduce you to the big board, where I will be your weatherman. The first thing that you might notice about the Star Trek Adventures Player's Guide is that no longer is it doing that whole dark background and light or even colored text thing. Instead, it's white paper and black text because that's what's easy on eyeballs to see. There was a high concept sort of thing going on with earlier releases in this game. Did not find a lot of enthusiasm in the role-playing community. It was frankly hard to remember where you saw something in the book because it was just a mess of dark background. For people with different levels of vision impairment and the like, it could be even harder. Now, Modiphius did do everyone the solid of providing high contrast black and white versions of the same rulebooks, but now we're into an era where I think that the game is acknowledging that graphic design can echo the Star Trek universe without going to that same length. And there's very good use of negative and positive space in the choice of layout. It's acknowledging some lessons learned, which we're going to see throughout. Like many releases for Star Trek role-playing games, more than one author is putting their voice into the mix. There's an editor who kind of needs to rein in a style guide. In some cases, it does feel like different authors have different levels of familiarity with the role-playing game itself. Let's look at this first chapter, which is all about what is Star Trek. It's almost like a creed. And then the second half of the chapter, what is it in particular about Star Trek Adventures? I'm going to spend a fair amount of time in this section, but as far as this sets the tone, sort of reveals the purpose and goals of the book, that's why I'm spending this much time on it. 10 facts about Star Trek. That's how this introduces it. You know, if I just started talking about Star Trek, you might wonder, which Star Trek are you thinking of, man? It says, hey, these are things that Star Trek has been, continues to be these things. Number one, Star Trek has a science fiction setting. In the book here, it says that means grounded in scientific principles and possible future science. That was true of the Next Generation Star Trek, especially. I would prefer, however, that, when it comes to science fiction, we might talk specifically about how a speculative future, where technology and science and the human race will be headed. Number two, Star Trek presents a positive, hopeful, and vibrant forecast. Today's problems can be solved. Things that are looming large for humanity right here and now won't always be the big things. There'll be other vistas before us that will challenge us in the future. Star Trek's always been that. Even when we were looking at Deep Space Nine, it was a challenge to say, okay, maybe we will summit this mountain, but there will be vistas beyond, and there'll be people who don't necessarily see things exactly the same way. So how will we deal with that? Number three, diversity, equity, and inclusion are paramount. Oh, that was a clever pun. This is true. I mean, Star Trek's always been at the leading edge of saying that all different kinds of people have a seat at the table and should be afforded the same opportunities. Even if we have to go out of our way, we owe it to them because of their humanity and also to live up to our own claims of being a great person. Now, the language chosen in this section uses words like there's a standard. Discrimination is prohibited. I would choose a different way of saying this. When I look at the people in the Star Trek setting, they're providing opportunities when they invite a kind of a balance of folks, inclusion. The reason they're doing that is because they don't think twice. It's sort of in their nature. It's a core value of their society, in the same way that when most people sneeze, we say Gesundheit or bless you. It's just natural. That's a vision. There will be basic agreement. in the future on that. And I think that's a little bit different than, there will be a wag of the finger. It's possibly an even more positive vision. Number 4, fundamental of the Star Trek universe, the characters build and nurture relationships. And I would agree with that. There's a lot of interpersonality to Star Trek. It's about the meeting of different sorts of folks who have different perspectives, get to know each other in a professional context and sometimes a personal one. Part of the optimism and part of the heartwarming part of Star Trek is that it has time and often is about how folks are holding each other up and reaching out to one another. Number 5, the franchise focuses on character over plot. I don't really know if this is a great contrast to draw, but it is, I think it's important to say that Star Trek's not exactly operatic. Characters live in a united federation of planets. I think that this is sort of how there's core area that the characters come from where peace reigns. One of the things is the principle of non-interference towards pre-warp cultures. This isn't a colonial game. Starfleet characters blaze the trail is number 7. I think this is a very important one, which is to say leading the way. When I get into disagreements in the internet with folks who say like the best way to have a Star Trek role-playing game is when you have the grunts that beam down and secure the area with their assault rifles and so on. And I say, on the contrary, in Star Trek, the captain or the first officer and so on, they beam down without so much as a small little hand phaser. They beam down like in their pajamas to show that they mean no harm, that they come in peace. And because they're just so excited to go see a new planet, that's the reason that they're here, is to go boldly. That sort of optimism and less paranoid way of approaching life is a tonic we could use more of in these times. Star Trek examines the human condition.
Oh, you betcha, yeah.
You might find that Star Trek Adventures will lead you into situations where, through the lens of your character, you'll be thinking about the human condition. Star Trek explores the wonders of the universe. Regular folks get a taste of the vast, unlearned things that humanity's yet to discover about the universe.
The universe. What a concept.
The universe is a little bit like the human hand. Grauman's center right here, and then you have undiscovered worlds and Sector 8.
Number 10, characters have some fun along the way. This is good to point out, as much as Star Trek is a space military, and they often say, yes, sir, you'll notice another thing is that there's not frequently a salute. Instead, there's a lot of hello, and there's a lot of levity and familiarity. It's another one of those optimistic things which, hopefully, even though we're all wearing masks all the time when we're at work and elsewhere, we'll remember that our acquaintances and our colleagues are people. Even when the job is hard, we can share in a bit of humor. Now, the 10 things that the Player's Guide has to say about Star Trek Adventures in particular, it's a way of talking right to the player. This is this particular kind of role-playing game, and it's not just got a Star Trek label on it. Number 1 is your ship, your crew, your adventures. You don't have to scratch your head and give yourself a headache finding how to fit into canon. Star Trek is big. You're free to create. Number 2, rules that support every era. This, I feel, is almost something that should have been in the core rulebook and blasted a good deal louder. Tricorder is a tricorder is a tricorder, and a phaser is a phaser is a phaser in Star Trek Adventures. The communicator, you can talk into it and ask to get beamed up.
Direct Enterprise. Scott here, sir. We're beaming up. Notify transporter room.
Regardless of what year it is. Because that's how Star Trek is on the shows. This is a game which is not going to trouble itself trying to chart the number of joules in a next generation phaser versus a TOS phaser. This is meant to maybe bring Star Trek fans together. And I think that's a good thing. Number 3, rules as light or as complex as needed. Boy, this is one that I don't like, because it essentially says All that you need to do as a player is know how to roll 2 die 20. Momentum and threat, how your starship work, those are all optional rules. You can add them whenever you want. Telling the player these are optional rules, and so if the game master is playing with them, the game master is maybe moving too fast for that player. So I don't like that. It's not the GM's prerogative which of the rules they're going to use, first of all. Secondly, things like task difficulty really only work in conversation with these other parts of the rules. So for example, firing a photon torpedo can easily be a difficulty 3 task. And so you're going to have to purchase additional dice by using momentum. You may need to use determination in order to create an advantage. You might need to make it so in order to even make something happen. You can create that shield frequency modulation to beam through the enemy shields. You might need to use determination to reach a high task difficulty of 4 or 5. So the idea that you only need to roll 2d20 and you'll be good to go, frankly, it's not true, because that would mean that you might be trying things that have difficulty 4 and 5 as your character, running up against this wall. You're not accessing the rest of the system, either because you've walled it off for the whole group by choosing not to use it, or it's not incumbent upon you as the player to learn it. And then it's incumbent upon the game master to set lower task difficulties because you don't want to learn the rules. I'm not a fan here. You can take your time learning any role-playing game, and I would be the first to say that you can make mistakes. You don't have to learn the whole thing at once. But I don't like this idea that you can chuck half the rule book and everything will be fine, because these rules, they really hold each other together. The concepts exist in consultation with each other. This is not a toolkit role-playing game.
I wanted to make sure that what I said was said the right way, and I wanted to make sure that the message was across that.
Number 4, character creation via life path. Boy, I really like life paths. Number 5, a role for everyone. Okay, I'm just going to read this one to you, and then I'm going to talk about my critique of it, because Some players have a preferred role to play in role-playing games, while others are happy to pick a role that best supports the other players and the needs of the game. See, it's like maybe the life path is going to inform you. No matter what type of player you are, what type of character you want to play, there's a place for them in Star Trek Adventures. If you come up with a character concept that excites you, but doesn't reflect the traditional idea of a Starfleet officer or Klingon warrior, brainstorm with your game master and fellow players to craft a place for your character in the game.
Now, the main problem area is up here. All of this going on up here is what's causing me the most physical discomfort.
So the reason I don't like this is because the whole point of Star Trek Adventures, the Starfleet book, and Star Trek Adventures, the Klingon book, is that it's a focused game. It's focused on a Starfleet ship. And this seems to be swinging the door wide open to, a whole barn door of different kinds of characters. The game master is then, it's incumbent upon him to contrive the reason that they stick together, rather than for the players to be cohesive because they're members of the same organization. One of the reasons that I'm excited about Star Trek Adventures, as opposed to kind of loose universe toolkit games, I, as the game master, can be excited about the adventures knowing that the characters are the sort of characters that will be animated by their role to go and confront those adventures. I don't know that this is a good thing to be telling the player in the player's guide. A GM prerogative thing. Player wants to make like an oddball character that it just isn't. And then this is also in the context of the player's guide, which is sort of speaking to people who haven't watched a lot of Star Trek, and it's saying like, oh, come up with a wild, zany character concept. Not a fan. Number 6, a concern for the greater good. This is great. One thing that I would say is that your determination, your values, can actually make it happen. So if you are concerned for the greater good through the abstraction of your character's values, you can literally make it happen. You as the player have that opportunity. For that matter, the fact that you as the player default to having the first round in combat means that karate chop that phaser out of the enemy hand and say, not so fast, buddy. It means that you can quickly tap your communicator and try and beam up.
The entire system's inhibited. The way it is now, we couldn't beam up a fly.
7, Collaborative problem solving. Characters surmount seemingly impossible odds in Star Trek stories. The television ones, the movie ones. And this game does that same thing too. The game is affirmative to how Star Trek protagonists, they're not in a simulation, kind of a war game. Instead, their moxie, their brainstorming charm that they have upon sort of the storyteller's voice, almost, is in the rules of this game. Maybe this game, the book could be a little bit more obvious. Number 8, opportunity for dramatic events. This is sort of a way of saying that the threat system and the way that the game master can spice things up. When you play Star Trek Adventures, you're going to get a natural feeling of escalation that you would in the television shows, and I'm glad that they're explaining it to the player in a really direct fashion. I've seen a lot of caution around threat, groups with uneven understanding of where that threat is going, people who feel like it's a competitive mechanic. Conversations in the comments of this YouTube channel. Suffice it to say, I'm happy to see it in this book. Number 9, story-driven gameplay. I think what they're saying here is that there's stuff like momentum and threat that can shape the scene economy. I think that it would be really nice if they also mentioned traits as a thing that the players can interact with. It'd be nice if they mention scenes, because Star Trek Adventures has the facilities to just set down one thing and pick up another. Number 10, a safe space in which to explore. They're basically saying like you should have a session 0 and you should talk about comfort zones, and I think that's great. I don't know that that's exactly a feature of this game in particular. That's what everybody should do for all role-playing games. There's a lot of trauma that Star Trek characters suffer. Commander Riker suffers a lot of romantic trauma, and he gets back in there, into the dating game, repeatedly, up to and including having to shoot his girlfriend of the week. I'm not going to talk about some other characters that have suffered trauma, because honestly, I don't want to, But suffice it to say, Star Trek does go there, and maybe your game will too, so you need to talk with your players. So that was Chapter 1 of the Star Trek Adventures Player's Guide. So I think you may see where this is going. Go boldly. As we get into these next chapters, you'll see how in some places it talks a lot about the universe of Star Trek with an eye towards role-playing, but nary an actual mention of a game concept in whole chapters of the book. Now, there's good stuff in there. There are crunchy bits and a whole lot of new talents, which I will be discussing. Is it ambitious? Yes, indeed. Uneven? Yeah. Is it an improvement in terms of the visuals, in terms of being self-aware about how Star Trek Adventures is a different kind of game? Yes, it is self-aware. But it's been a long time getting from there to here.